Oh, wow. Thank you very much. That's fantastic. Yes, do let us know where you're from, where you're joining us from today. That would be absolutely great. We have some time in our event, lots of time for questions. Do put your comments and questions into the chat box. We'll have lots of time to answer them, I hope, because today in this webinar, we're going to be looking at peer review, but from a slightly different perspective, a little bit different to what you may have heard about peer review in the past. Everybody's very familiar with the peer review process. As researchers, usually people tend to have quite negative feelings about the peer review process as researchers, because usually when you end up going through the peer review process, it's often a bit of an ordeal. It's often a bit of a nightmare. Absolutely. We are going to give everybody a recording, as I understand, access to a recording of this event, and there'll also be a certificate, and Naran and team will be back a little bit later to talk about what you need to do in order to get access to the recording and to the certificate. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. In our event today, we are going to be talking about how to manage and learn to develop your transferable skills in peer review. And I see that one colleague has their hand up already. Maybe we can ask you to put your questions in the chat box. We'll get back to you as soon as we can. And there will be a short period, a long period of time for questions at the end of our event. Today, I'm Gareth. I do lots of training, lots of webinars. I worked in the UK and Ireland, in the US, in Hungary, publishing papers in my research career, also working as a peer reviewer and managing peer review for an international journal published by Taylor and Francis. And I've been doing that now for 18 years. So lots of experience, both managing peer review as a researcher, doing peer review as a peer reviewer, which is what we're going to be focusing on really in our event this evening, how you can use the peer review process to develop transferable skills for your career as a researcher and beyond. So let's get going. Let's dive in. Let's start to think about peer review itself. So peer review, of course, as you are probably well aware, is the cornerstone of academic publishing, and all reputable journals use peer review. And that's what allows us to be able to trust the content that gets published in those journals. So we are aiming to get our research published as much as possible in peer-reviewed journals as far as we can. So you should be aiming to get your great research published, if you can, in a peer-reviewed journal. But something that you may not know is that the peer review process is dating back to the 1730s, to the 18th century. In the 18th century, in 1731, the Royal Society of Edinburgh published a series of peer-reviewed medical articles. Colleagues are complaining that they can't hear my voice in the event. I hope that that's just a one-off situation. Maybe we can confirm that the audio is working. But what we're talking about on this slide is the fact that although we often think that peer review has been around for ages, it's as old as the hills, and indeed there are some examples of peer review from as far back as the 18th century, from 1731, as you can see here. It's actually relatively recently. Nature didn't start using peer review until the 1960s, the late 1960s, as you can see here, 1940s for that other internationally famous journal, Science. So that's a bit later in time than a lot of people would have expected. Peer review for most international academic journals is not such an old phenomenon. It's something that hasn't been around for as long as many people would have thought. And indeed, when we go ahead and ask people, as we're going to do now, and you can stick your answers, you can type your answers if you'd like to get involved in this into the chat box. What's the main function of peer review? In your opinion, why do journals do peer review? One, I already kind of answered that when I was talking a little bit earlier on, but what's the main function of peer review? And Mohammed says it's to detect faults. What else? Other people may want to ensure the credibility of content. Great answer. It's a good question. And actually, when we ask this question to critique the paper, Manar says, what's the main function of peer review? Why do journals put papers through the peer review process? To find mistakes, to clarify the quality of the articles. Actually, most people answer this question, ensure the accuracy, check for internal and external issues, external validity, make sure the validity of content, add it to knowledge. Most people say something like to improve the quality of papers. Most people say that the main function of peer review is to improve the quality of my paper, of their paper, but that's not actually the main function of peer review. The main function of peer review, of course, as many of you have written in the chat box, is to ensure the quality of content that gets published in the international literature. A byproduct of the peer review process is to help you improve the quality of your paper, but that's not its main function. And so, as we mentioned at the start of this event this evening, we are looking at accuracy, quality, and the value of analyses in articles submitted to international journals that gets filtered through the peer review process and ends up appearing in international journals as hopefully useful content for researchers. So the main function of this process is to filter and quality control content, research articles that go into the international literature. And of course, as a byproduct of that, your paper will also, we hope, get better as a result of going through the peer review process. But what about if you get asked to perform it, or indeed have to go through it? As you can see in this cartoon, it's often a bit of a nightmare. People feel generally very relieved and very tired, exhausted when their papers finally get accepted after going through the peer review process. And in my view, that's not the way that it should be. This process should be a positive experience, and it should be a great way for us to gain transferable skills that we can then use in other aspects of our careers, be those careers in research or elsewhere. So during peer review, a couple of things to look out for. During the peer review process, you may be asked to add citations written by that particular reviewer to the paper, and you shouldn't do that. You may be asked to make changes or more favorably reflect earlier work, and of course you shouldn't do that either. And you may also be asked to remove or modify hypotheses to placate a reviewer. If you get asked any of those things as an author during the peer review process, what you need to do is flag them to the editor. Get in touch with the editor, make sure the editor knows that this has happened, because these are the kinds of unethical things that should not be happening in the peer review process. If you have issues as an author in the peer review process, be open to writing to the journal editor. Journal editors like me, we love it actually if people get in touch with us and write to us and talk to us about the papers, about the process, ask for help. A lot of people think that journal editors are up there somewhere in a castle on a hill. They can't be approached, they can't be talked to during the manuscript peer review process, and that's absolutely not the case. Journal editors act as police to control the quality of the peer review process. So that's our starting point for our event this evening. Peer review filters and improves content that goes into international journals for researchers. And of course, it should be a positive process. It should improve your paper. Peer review should mean that your work, when it gets published, is positively advancing the field, okay? And people often think that there's some kind of obligation on them to get involved in the peer review process as a reviewer for journals. There isn't really, but we want in this event this afternoon, to turn this around and make this into a positive experience so that you can get something out of the peer review process for your career, for transferable skill development as a researcher, both from your perspective, putting a paper through the process, and if you get asked to do peer review by a journal. We believe that peer review papers are reliable because they've been through this process before publication. So this is the basis of our presentation. This is the basis of what we're going to be talking about today. So did you know, and this is a little bit out of date, this report, but nevertheless, the results presented in it are quite interesting. I thought you'd be keen to see this kind of thing. In 2018, 33% of reviews from around the world were performed in the United States. It generally took about 2.5 editorial invitations for one review to get received by a journal editorial office. And this has increased substantially over the course of the pandemic. It's gotten really, really, really difficult for journals to find good peer reviewers. And we've seen this in our journal. It's becoming more and more difficult to get busy researchers to give up their time to perform peer review. It's harder to find people to do the work. And of course, we'll talk about this in our Q&A. I'm sure at the end, we don't get paid or remunerated or rewarded usually in any way as researchers when we do work for journals in the peer review process. So that's important to keep in mind. 70% of people in this survey, when invited to peer review for journals, rejected those invitations, mostly because the invitations came out of scope. And it's interesting to note as well that reviewers in lower income countries tend to perform reviews more often on time than reviewers in higher income countries, at least according to this 2018 global survey of peer review that was published by Publons. So in terms of managing the process as an editor, I can tell you that we are looking for timeliness. We are looking for reviews that are unbiased. We're looking for reviews to maintain confidentiality. We're looking for honesty in peer review, and we're looking for expertise when we select reviewers to do the work. And that's something that you can make sure that you have on your website, on your CV as a researcher, if you are out there looking for this kind of experience as a researcher. So these are the kinds of issues that we look for, the kinds of things that we look at when we are assessing whether or not an individual would be appropriate to be invited to perform peer review for a journal. Is there going to be a conflict of interest? Is this person going to perform the review honestly? Will it be unbiased? Are they appropriate in their expertise to assess this particular paper? And also very important to journals, of course, because it feeds into impact factor calculations, the timeliness of peer review. Lots of people at our journal accept to do a peer review and then sit on it for months and months on end. So that's also something that we'll look at in a moment. And of course, you'll be aware of how the peer review process is working. Most journals out there around the world are using one of these 4 different kinds of peer review for their journal submissions. The most common, of course, is what we like to call single blind up there at the top, where the reviewer remains anonymous to the author. It's the most common. It's actually the most popular as well amongst authors around the world. But lots of journals increasingly are offering people the opportunity to have their papers double blind reviewed. And that's where, of course, both the author and the reviewer remain anonymous to each other. Lots of authors in certain countries, China, India, to name 2, prefer this kind of peer review because they feel that it eliminates any potential bias in the process. And as you saw on the previous slide, bias in peer review can be a serious issue, and it's something that editors are aware of. Editors are trained to look out for. The other two, less common but increasing in their proportion across the scholarly publishing, international publishing landscape: open peer review, where no one is anonymous, the kind of review that you might find, for example, on a preprint server, where you put your paper up there, people comment on your paper, and then the journal that your paper ends up getting published in may use those peer review comments as part of their formal peer review process. That's open peer review. Transferable, on the other hand, that's a situation where you might submit your paper to a Nature journal or a journal within the Neuroscience Research Consortium, and then the paper gets rejected from your first choice, and so it gets transferred to another journal, Nature to Scientific Reports or Nature Communications, for example, and the review reports from the first submission go with the paper in order to speed up that process. So we know how peer review works. On the left-hand side here, you can see some of the kinds of things that editors are asking peer reviewers to assess when they look at journal articles and consider them for publication in international journals. Are the hypotheses relevant? Is the methodology appropriate? Is the data analysis good? Something that Naran and the team know lots and lots about. Is the data complete, and are the conclusions of the paper valid? It's a good checklist to have if you're asked by a journal to perform peer review. These would be some of the kinds of things that you would be looking at when you go in and start to assess a paper potentially for publication in an international journal. And again, here we go. You can go for blind peer review if you want. This is something that lots of authors like to do. They like to select a journal where the reviewer and the author remain anonymous to each other. This is often preferred, as we've talked about. It's not the most preferred kind of peer review. That's still single blind, the one that's used by most journals and preferred by most authors. But in many cases, when submitting your paper to a journal, you will have the choice of single blind or double blind peer review. And if you go for double blind, make sure that you do certain things to your paper in order to completely disguise your identity to the editor and to the reviewers, such as turning off your track changes, all of the author identification marks in your Word documents and PDFs, your preferences, your user information. For example, we get lots of papers submitted to us that are double blinded, ready for peer review, but once you open them, you can quickly see that the paper had been submitted by Dr. Naran to the journal, because there's the comments, there's the preferences, there's the identification marks in the PDF. So keep that in mind as well. And don't forget as well that it's also a good idea, if you do want to remain anonymous in the peer review process, to cite your own work in an anonymous way. You don't want to say something like, as we recently showed, and then cite Dyke et al. 2022, because then, of course, that shows the peer reviewer who you are as an author immediately. So if you want to remain anonymous, there are certain things that you need to do to your paper and certain things that you need to write, certain ways that you need to write in order to make that clear, and that you do, in fact, remain anonymous in the peer review process. So as you can see on the table here, data for China and India in this Nature Communications survey of uptake of single blind and double blind peer review. Data for China and India show increased uptake of double blind peer review. If you have a quick look at the table, you can see on the top there, double blind peer review, DBPR, versus single blind peer review. In those countries in this survey, Nature Communications has been offering its authors the option of single blind or double blind peer review for submitted articles for a number of years. You can see that in this data, quite interestingly, most countries people go for single blind, but in some countries, there's a preference for double blind. And of course, that is an effort to remove perceived bias from the peer review process. So this suggests that colleagues in certain countries, in certain parts of the world, are more worried about reviewer bias than in other parts of the world, which is quite interesting. So we've discussed the different kinds of peer review. Let's think quickly about sending your next paper to a journal that's going to use double-blind peer review. This is where you and the reviewer are hidden from each other. You do need to make sure that you do take care to actually anonymize yourself in your article. Submit your title page and acknowledgements as separate files. Anonymize those place names. Don't write "as we previously showed" and then cite yourself, and remove those author identifiers from Word and PDF submissions. It's something that sounds very obvious, but of course it's important if you do want to protect your identity from a potential reviewer. And I would also say very important transferable skill for life in general. Stay polite in your email communication. Here's an email that I got relatively recently at the editorial office of our journal. Dear editor, who reviewed my paper? I need to know. The comments I received are extremely unfair and just plain wrong. Who wrote this about my work? Please write me immediately. The examples that I'll share with you in this presentation today are real emails. People actually write emails like this to editors. And of course, this is one of the reasons why reviewers, peer reviewers, if you're in that position, may want to hide your identity from the authors. That's why journals do this. They blind peer review. Editors may offer this to reviewers in order that they get more honest appraisals. Higher impact factor journals do this as a matter of course. Of course, if you get a paper to review for Nature and the authors know your identity and the paper gets rejected, they might keep that in mind in the future, because these kinds of publications, of course, are career-changing publications. Of course, everything is open to abuse. Lots of people will say there's too much power in the hands of peer reviewers, but we'll come back and we'll talk about that in a moment when we get on to actually doing peer review ourselves. So you should, as authors, be checking what kinds of peer review are available to you at the target journals that you're selecting. Choosing which kind of peer review works best for you, double blind, single blind, or completely open. Lots of authors are using preprint servers now so that they can get quick, open comments from their research community about their papers, and that speeds up the whole process. Lots of authors are also hiding their identity in the peer review process to remove any perception of perceived bias. So it really is in your hands in the process these days as an author what will happen to your paper. And often it's the case that open peer review, transparent peer review, pre-printed peer review, where you can see the whole history of the paper, you can see the whole history of all the comments made about a particular paper, can actually be preferred by authors. And indeed, in situations where review is open on a preprint server, for example, as you can see in this trial again conducted by Nature Communications, reviewers tend to be more polite. Of course they do. If the authors and the wider public, the wider research community is going to know your identity, you're not going to be making rude comments about somebody else's paper the way that you might do, or a lot of people do, when peer review is anonymized. So that's also something to keep in mind. And that's another reason why it's important for authors to have the choice about the different kinds of peer review that they want their papers to experience. Lots of journals are now offering all of these different options to authors. When you get rejected, though, of course, and here's a few more examples of real emails that we do get as an author, Editors are clicking buttons in automated systems. You shouldn't take the emails that you receive from editorial offices all that personally. The referees can just calm down. I will get the impression that they will just come up with another reason to frustrate my study. So maybe just forget that I submitted it in the first place and find someone else to review the paper. Versus, thank you so much for considering my manuscript, and thanks to the reviewers for their valuable and constructive suggestions and comments. If you give me the chance to make the revisions to my manuscript, I will fully consider all of the comments and I will fully satisfy them. So, transferable skill for your career, for life in general, number one from this event today, this evening: politeness in emails, politeness in communication, constructiveness in communication can go a long way, because of course we do see lots of bias in the peer review process. Here's a paper that I published in 2017 on the author list here of this paper. We tried and tried and tried to get it published. I was working at the time in Hungary, lots of colleagues from Romania on this paper. We couldn't get it published until we added an author from the University of Manchester. Then, of course, the paper got immediately accepted. So this kind of thing should not be happening in the peer review process. Peer review bias is there. We know that it's there. Geographic bias. If you have a famous or more successful co-author, of course, your paper unfortunately has a higher chance of favorable peer review. And that shouldn't be happening. That shouldn't be happening. And that's another reason why it's a good thing if the reviews are either completely open or completely hidden. So from the perspective of doing a peer review, from the perspective of being asked to perform peer review, you can see on this slide the kinds of things that we ask peer reviewers to assess in their reports. Peer review aims. We ask peer reviewers to have a look at papers in terms of the originality, the novelty, and the potential impact. And then secondly, we also ask peer reviewers to have a think about the study quality, the reporting quality, the ethics, and the integrity of the work. And so you can use these kinds of checklists both as a reviewer and as an author to enhance your article's chances of successful publication. If you know the kinds of things that journals are going to ask peer reviewers to comment on, such as on this slide, you are able to put them into your paper, into your cover letter, and therefore give your work a higher chance of acceptance. And as we mentioned earlier in this presentation, finding peer reviewers is often difficult, and it's getting more and more difficult. There's me, the editor, up there on the top of the slide, writing to follow up with a peer reviewer. Dear doctor, please can we follow up and ask about your review of, we appreciate your time, but your review is now 6 weeks overdue and our authors are getting anxious. Thanks very much for your time. First email from the reviewer, well, the authors should have written a better paper then. Second email received 5 minutes later from the peer reviewer, find another reviewer, remove my name from your database. So this kind of thing is happening as well. Sometimes these things happen. This is why at journal editorial offices, we invite 4 or more reviewers for each paper, and then we wait until we have enough balanced reviews back to make a decision as an editor. So that's also important to keep in mind as an author. So peer review is the process then we use to judge the quality of academic papers submitted for publication in scholarly journals. And peer-reviewed papers are thought to be reliable because they have been through this process before publication. So you should always, as an author, be aiming to publish your work in a journal that uses peer review. And keep in mind as an author and also as a potential peer reviewer, when you get asked to perform peer review for a journal, most people have a negative mindset. Most people think, how am I going to destroy this paper? How am I going to find the problems with this paper? How am I going to point out the shortcomings of this article. Peer reviewers usually look for problems. They think, where are the issues? And very often the issues that they find are in the method section. So if you know this as an author and also as a peer reviewer, you can improve your papers and you can also improve the constructiveness of your peer review. Be positive when you comment on the work of others. Imagine in the future you are not working in academia, you are working for Mars Research Hub, you're working for an organization like that, and your boss gives you a document to comment on. Dr. Naran gives you a document to comment on. Be positive, be constructive, because of course that's going to be appreciated and that may also enhance your career. Being negative, knocking the work down, pointing out all of the problems, not helping others to improve their work is a negative starting point. So let's think about how we can help authors to improve their papers in peer review, rather than how we can point out the issues with papers when we get them to peer review ourselves. And when it comes, of course, to selecting peer reviewers, use your international network. Think about senior colleagues, authors of other papers in your field, not colleagues, not students, not recent collaborators. Reach out to people and talk to them about your research. You will build your network, and then you'll have good suggestions to make to journals when it comes time to make recommendations for peer reviewers for your paper. And this is a question that we get asked all the time. I've just been invited by Nature, by Science, to perform a peer review. I'm really nervous about that. I'm a young researcher. I'm an up-and-coming academic. Should I do it? Should I do a review? Should I do a peer review when I've been asked to do one by a journal? Things to consider. Do you have any conflicts of interest? Do you know the authors? Have you worked with them? Is this your field? Do you have the expertise? Are you really the right person to perform this review? Don't get imposter syndrome. Don't sell yourself short. If it's the topic of your current research, of your PhD, then of course it is your field and you do have the expertise. Thirdly, do you have the time? Really, do you have the time? Because there's nothing worse for your career, your relationship with a journal, your relationship with an editor, than accepting to perform peer review, to do a peer review, and then not doing it in time, or worse, doing it, but doing it quickly and not doing a very good job. This is a very important transferable skill. Inside and outside of academia, your responsibilities when asked to comment on the work of others: be responsible, be thorough, and be positive. And I can tell you from my own experience that this is absolutely not the way that most people are when they perform peer review for international journals. As we've talked about already, you are going to conduct a fair and balanced assessment of a colleague's work. You're going to be asked to assess the suitability for publication of this paper in a particular journal. Let's try to help people to improve their papers rather than pointing out all of the issues. The benefits of this, of course, are that you develop a reasoned and positive attitude to research, which is a very good thing that will come across in your own writing. It will come across in your own interactions with other colleagues. You'll get also to understand journal production processes. You'll get access to the editorial office. You'll get access to an editor. You will be able to understand journal production processes, the understanding of that editorial process. And of course, especially, you'll get to develop your interpretation and your reading, your critical reading skills. So there are a number of key benefits to doing peer review. There are a number of very good reasons why you should think about doing this. It's an excellent way to keep up to date in your field. How do other people write and structure papers? What does submitted papers look like? If you're thinking of putting a paper together for submission yourself, to an international journal, then looking at peer reviewing papers is a great way to get yourself in shape for doing that. And you can look at how authors make figures and tables, use those kind of style guidelines in your own work as you build and as you develop your own style as an author. You're going to get access to the literature, critical experience, access to editors. So the next time that you make a submission, the editor knows you because you did a positive review of a journal. And you may also get new ideas and directions for your own research, although of course you can't plagiarize from peer-reviewed articles that you're working on, but you can see where the field is going. You'll learn also how to sell your own work. So ask yourself 2 key questions as a starting point when you're invited by a journal to peer review a paper. Is the question important and interesting, or is it trivial? And are the methods appropriate? 2 key questions as a starting point for peer review. Is it important and interesting, or is it trivial? And are the methods appropriate? Is the journal choice appropriate for this study? Is the hypothesis, the method appropriate? What do you think about the study? Journals are very interested in learning about your opinion of a piece of work. Do you think it's good? Do you think it's interesting? Do you think other people are going to want to read it? Write that kind of thing down in your review. Provide a thoughtful and balanced assessment, commenting on the science, not necessarily the writing. You are not being asked to edit the paper. That's my job. That's the journal's job. You are being asked to comment on the science, but you'd be surprised. You'd be amazed how many people actually spend loads of time working on the language in submitted papers. Comment on the science, not necessarily the writing. Your job is not to act as an editor. If you get a paper for review and you find it hard to understand, you can't understand the English, it's difficult to penetrate, send it back to the editor and ask them to get the authors to pay or get an edit done on the paper. Journals are all different, of course. Some will lead you, others won't, but this is key for you to save time commenting on the science, not necessarily the writing. And finally, I have some tips on how to do the peer review itself. Learning to read the work of others in 3 different ways. Read the paper, first of all, as somebody else in the field to understand the content and focus of the work. Then read the paper again and put yourself in the position of a competitor to that piece of research. Remain balanced, remain positive, as we've talked about before, but think about the work as if you were a competitor to that research group. And then thirdly, read the paper again, think about the paper as if you were a colleague working in the same department, and your main goal here is to help the authors improve the quality of their paper. So reading a paper in these 3 different ways, as somebody else in the field, which you are, as a competitor, which you may very well be, as a colleague working in the same department, which you shouldn't be if you are performing a peer review. So that's important as well in order to be positive. How can you find ways to help the author improve? Far too often, as we've talked about in our event today, reviewers tend to think, how can I find ways to reject this paper? Constructive positivity in peer review is a key transferable skill and something that you can really gain from the process. Your colleagues and collaborators will really appreciate. So with that, I'll say thank you very much for listening. It's been great to give this presentation this evening. We've talked about the peer review process, and we've talked about a few ways in which you can manage and learn from the peer review process to develop your transferable skills. I hope that I will be doing more webinars in the future for Naran and the Mars Research Hub team. But with that, I will hand back over to them for the Q&A. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you for your attention today.
Thanks, Gareth. Okay, I'll call Nuran.
Right.
Yeah, I'm here. I had just muted my microphone during the webinar. Thank you so much, Gareth. You are muted also. Sarah, you had muted Gareth.
I'm
Okay.
here. No, I'm here. I'm good. I'm good. I've got a bit of a cough. I've got a bit of a cough today, so I had to like cough a few times during that. So
Yeah,
thank you
our
for the
audience
comments.
are very much excited, as you're seeing from the chat box.
Great. Well, now we have time
Yay,
for
that's the
questions.
spirit.
I wonder if there are any questions in the chat box. I'm just
Okay. I
scrolling
believe,
through.
Sarah, was there any questions or something?
No, no. On the Facebook,
Okay,
on the
okay.
Facebook, no.
So this is perfect. Thank you, everyone. Please don't forget to fill in the certificate form. The certificate form is a completely different one than that of the registration. Yeah, we have, I have a question if you have 5 minutes to answer. This is Dr. Ayman. Okay, Dr. Ayman, please. Don't forget to fill in your certificate form to receive your certificate and share it everywhere. You will find Mars team sharing you up and increase your visibility.
Sorry. Was a question asked? Could you repeat the question for me?
I'm waiting for the question.
Okay.
Yes, the recording will be posted on our YouTube channel. Yes, of course. I believe there are no questions now. I believe, Gareth, you had fulfilled every tip that anyone could think about.
That's great. Wow, that's great. That's a first for me.
There's someone asking how to be a peer reviewer.
How to be a peer reviewer? Well, that's a great question. The best way to become a peer reviewer is to write to journals and write to journal editors and ask them. Let's write to journal editors and ask them about whether you have the chance to do peer review. That's the best way to get the chance to do peer review. To reach out to journal editors and ask them. And say, you know, I'm so and so. This is my CV. Like, I would like to be added to your database as a potential reviewer, because this is certainly a great thing for journals. They're always looking for young researchers, especially in order for young researchers to volunteer. To be doing webinar, doing peer review. So that's a great question. Thank you.
Yeah, someone is asking, is it right to get comments from 10 reviewers on your paper? Yeah.
It can happen.
It happened to me.
Really? 10 reviewers.
Yeah, someone is asking this. Is it right to get comments from 10 reviewers on your paper?
Well, it can happen. I mean, I've had papers in our journal that have gone through multiple rounds of peer review. You know, that multiple rounds of peer review that have ended up getting about that number of peer reviews overall. So it can happen. It would be unusual for an article in first review to receive that many comments, but it certainly can happen. And in situations where there's very strong conflict between the different reviewers about the suitability of the paper for publication, you know? So
yeah, Dr. Saeed is asking, is there any specific qualification criteria for being a peer reviewer?
Well, the only specific qualification requirement for being a peer reviewer is that you have yourself research expertise in that particular area. So if you're doing a PhD or working on a postdoc, or you're a researcher in that particular area, then that's the only qualification that you need. It may help that you've published some articles in that particular field. That's one way that journals find peer reviewers, for example. But if you are interested in getting that experience to do peer review, then you should write to journal editors. So there's nothing stopping young researchers writing to journal editors and saying, I'm a PhD student working on this topic. I'd love to get experience reviewing for your journal. Editors love that. So I do encourage anyone listening to this who'd like to get this kind of experience to reach out to journals. But that's a really good question. Thank you for that question.
Gareth, if you allow me, I want to add one more thing.
Of course.
I have seen young researchers, early career researchers that are not PhDs. They are undergraduate and have actually hit 10, 15 peer-reviewed publications. So
yeah,
so
absolutely.
So I believe, I don't know if I'm right or not, but I believe in this situation, they may apply for journals to be a peer reviewer.
In
Or
fact,
what do you think?
well, absolutely. In fact, the journal editor won't know if the person being invited to perform peer review has a PhD or not. They won't know that. They'll just be finding them based on their publication record because they're using databases to search for keywords. So it actually doesn't matter if you have a PhD or not. It just matters that you have relevant and proven research experience in that particular field. Okay.
Yeah, because
so
I have seen many CVs when we had posted one of our scholarships. I have seen actually hundreds of undergraduates from all over the world that have research experience, even beating those who have PhDs. So what I'm saying here is we should balance between those both things, having a postgraduate qualifications and having research qualification. This is my point.
Yeah, it's important, and I think the important point here is that if you want to get peer review experience, that's very important to get. And as Mara was saying, it's a voluntary thing. Yeah, but do apply to journals and ask for that opportunity. I think that's really, really important. Okay, thank you for these questions. It's great.
This is a question I have seen multiple times. You know, Gareth, this thing about that peer reviewing process is a volunteer one and it's take a lot of time. And the arising question, what will a peer reviewer get any benefits? What is the benefit of being a peer reviewer? So someone is asking now how I can get money from peer reviewing, or it is just as a free scientific serving only?
There are a number of ways in which you can get benefits from peer review. If you're signed up on Publons, for example, that's one way. Have a look at a site as well that's called reviewercredits.com, reviewercredits.com. This is another great way to get credit for peer review, you know, so that's another way. But yeah, generally speaking, journals are not able, or they say that they're not able to pay peer reviewers for their time working on academic papers. And that's, you know, when you think about it, that's kind of a little strange because of course they're making lots of money from the publication when it comes out. They're asking authors to pay article processing charges to get the paper published. So it's all you should look at Publons, you should look at reviewercredits.com. You should talk to journal editors again. If you do a review for a journal that has an article processing charge, that's an open access journal, for example, I would recommend that you say, I'll do the review, but in return for a discount on my next publication in your journal, for example. Okay, so those are ways in which you can get some something back from the process.
Yeah, there is another long thread about for someone to be a peer reviewer, they do their best to deliver the comments maybe in 10 or 14 days maximum. But once they submit their own paper, it got delayed even to a few months. So Dr. Ahmed
Yeah,
here is
right.
asking, what can a journal do about the delay of peer review? All journal
Well,
had all the journal he had reviewed for had finished on the specific time, but when he submit, he got delayed. Got me?
yes, 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 yes. That's right. So this is important because you need to communicate with editors. If you end up waiting for your paper to get, if you end up waiting for your paper to get peer reviews to come back for longer than 6 to 8 weeks, then it's really important that you do get in touch with the editor because, of course, as you've absolutely correctly mentioned, as you've absolutely correctly mentioned, like journals will give you a deadline as a peer reviewer when you're asked to perform peer review, but then you often end up waiting yourself as an author for a long time for papers to come back, you know, which can be really annoying. So in those situations, I would strongly recommend that you write to the editor and say, hey, I've been waiting for more than 6 weeks. Is it possible now to get some information back about my paper? Okay. Absolutely.
There
Yeah.
is, I think this is the last question, and it is a great one.
Cool.
What do you think the impact of the AI revolution like ChatGPT on scientific writing?
Wow. Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question.
Yeah. This is a great one. Thank you for this question.
We have been looking at ChatGPT and we've been looking at other AI tools. Well, for writing papers and certainly for editing papers at the moment, they're absolutely fantastic. So, you know, if you have some data or you have some content written, some text written, then certainly there's ways to get it edited, ways to get it expanded. I'm not sure yet that we're at the point that these AI tools can really write academic papers, research papers to the level that you would be able to, but I think we'll get there. We'll absolutely get there. They can already format reference lists. They can already put text into the right format for submission for particular journals. We've been testing GPT, asking it to write popular summaries of papers that have been published in international journals, and it's doing a fantastic job. So absolutely, I think it's really a great thing and a great
Yeah,
development for
this
the
revolution in technology is really scary.
yeah, it is indeed.
Yeah, believe me, it's really scary. It is very scary. I believe that the ChatGPT itself hadn't reached that far to write a manuscript and put the citation in the right order and everything. But soon, I believe soon, there will be another software that will be AI trained also and edit our paper just like that, not
Right,
just the language editing like in AGE, to edit it
that's right,
from.
exactly,
Yeah, I
indeed,
believe so.
absolutely.
I don't know why, but I believe we will reach there.
We will, I hope so. Yeah, absolutely. It's very exciting times, everybody. And
Yeah,
now's the
and
time
crazy
to be a
time also.
research, not yet at the point that we can ask these AI tools to perform peer review, but maybe we will be there in the future. That would be great, wouldn't it? If, you know, we didn't have to, you know, do any peer review anymore. But I still think it's a very important skill to develop, very important transferable skill, something that you should look at very seriously if you have the chance as a young researcher to get involved in doing it. Also, always try to remain positive when you're doing peer review. And thank you everybody for attending this event today.
Thank you
Yeah.
so much, Gareth. Thank you, everyone. Hope seeing you again. We'll send you all the certificates if you hadn't already received them, and also the link to the recording on our YouTube channel. Thank you very much, everyone. Hope to see you soon in other events. Please log into our newsletter to receive our blog post in English and Arabic and all our other webinars, even the previous webinar with Gareth. So stay tuned. I will send you everything through the mail.